The first time Republicans were struggling to elect a Speaker of the House this year, they almost came to blows.
Look at somebody's holding somebody back. Look at that. Oh, somebody just held somebody back. Stephanie, just look at that. It looks like a fight breaking out on the floor.
Republican Congressman Mike Rogers had to be physically restrained from lunging at Congressman Matt Gaetz on the House floor. And if you remember, that was January 6th of this year, the 2-year anniversary of the violent attack that took place in that very chamber. And today, House Republicans appear to have not learned much in the intervening months. Today, Republicans held a closed-door meeting to decide how to move forward after 2 failed votes to elect a new speaker. And during that meeting, Congressman Matt Gaetz reportedly stood up to speak, at which point Illinois Republican Mike Bost almost lunged at him. So once again, we've reached the lunging at Matt Gaetz part of the speaker cycle, which I did not know was an actual thing until now. Going into that meeting, there had been a lot of speculation that Republicans might coalesce around a plan to empower Congressman Patrick McHenry as a temporary speaker. But coming out of that meeting today, multiple Republicans announced that that plan is now dead. Congressman Jim Jordan, for his part, is still attempting to win the gavel, despite his historic loss earlier this week. Late today, he met with the 22 Republican holdouts who opposed his candidacy, some of whom say they have received death threats over their opposition. Tonight, Punchbowl News is reporting that every single Republican in that meeting told Jim Jordan that they will not back his bid for Speaker, all of which poses a major problem for both Jim Jordan and the House Republican Conference. There is apparently no viable Republican candidate for Speaker of the House. Nonetheless, Jim Jordan's office announced that a 3rd speaker vote is scheduled for tomorrow at 10 a.m. Joining me now to help me figure out what is happening here is South Carolina Democrat Congressman Jim Clyburn. He is the Assistant Democratic Leader in the House. Congressman Clyburn, thank you for joining me tonight. There seems to be so much confusion in the House Republican Conference. I'm wondering whether you can tell us your understanding of the situation as it stands right now. Do you believe that Republicans have completely closed the door on the idea of Patrick McHenry being made a more medium-term speaker?
Well, thank you very much for having me. It seems that way. And that's very, very regretful. I do believe that the American people are looking to us for civility, for cooperation, and quite frankly, for compromise. Nobody gets their way all of the time, and we should, as leaders in this great country, demonstrate to the American people that we understand what it is to find common ground and what is required. Now, they are holding on, my Republican friends, to a rule set, we call it the Hastert rule, that you got to have all Republicans on board and not need any Democrats. Well, that's not the country. This country is pretty evenly divided politically, and we ought to complement our work here by reflecting what the country stands for. And so to have a bipartisan path forward would be in keeping with the makeup of the American people at this particular juncture. And I don't know why they are resisting that.
I have my theories about why they don't want to be bipartisan. But I guess I wonder what happens now. Patrick McHenry has said, if you guys want me to do the business of the House without formally investing me with the powers to do that business, which is to say without a vote, I'm not going to do it. I'm quitting. I'm out of here. There is no plan A here, Congressman. There is no plan B, and there is certainly no plan C. What do you think happens next as far as the House ever functioning again?
Well, from what I've been hearing tonight, it seems as if we're going to meet tomorrow at 10 o'clock and there's going to be a vote. Now, I'm told that the vote will be for Speaker, that Jordan will put his name forward again. Well, I'm also told that he's been in the meeting with the 20 or 22 people who voted against him, and they all said they're not going to vote for him. So why would we put the American people through that? Why don't we just do something of a temporary basis on an interim basis? And that's what we need to do. Give Patrick McHenry the authority he needs for the next few months until maybe the end of the year so that he can get us to doing what we need to do. The president just gave an incredible speech to the American people, showing why he sits in that office and demonstrating the results of the meetings he had while in the war zone. And we've got a president going to the war zone who is now sending to us a request for us to do what we need to do to maintain our relationships with our allies across the world, and also to do what is necessary to assist Israel. And we don't have the wherewithal to get it done. That doesn't make sense. Let's put the people of America above our partisan politics and get this done. And let's revisit politics at a later time.
Given what you just said, I would love your reaction to Kevin McCarthy, who today is blaming Democrats for this dysfunction, saying every single Democrat chose to create this chaos. Your response to that?
Well, you know, I don't know what Kevin is talking about. You may recall the morning after the Democrats gave him more votes than his own Republicans gave him for his bill to keep the government open. That was not our bill. That was his bill. And we gave him more votes for his bill than he got from his own conference. And then he goes on television the next morning blaming Democrats for wanting to shut the government down. For some strange reason, he seemed to be living in another world. Nobody watching the leader of the Democrats, Hakeem Jeffries, reaching out 2 days ago saying that we will be willing to be a part of a temporary solution, bring Patrick McHenry forward, and he demonstrated in all of that he had to say that we Democrats are willing to go with a temporary solution to give them time to get their stuff together. It seemed to me that he ought to be grateful for that, but they seem to be ungrateful.
Yeah, ungrateful. Probably being a bit euphemistic, kind of generous using that adjective. Congressman Jim Clyburn, good luck to you, sir. Good luck to us all. Thank you for your time tonight.
Thank you very much. We're going to need it.
You sure will. Coming up, if you thought House Republicans were crazy, recall Donald Trump's former lawyer and conspiracy whisperer, Sidney Powell. Today, she pled guilty on the eve of her Georgia trial and agreed to testify against all of her fellow defendants, including Donald Trump. What it could mean for the 45th president, that's next.
Like I said, we were all kind of laughing. The phone was on speaker, but we were muted, so she couldn't hear us. And, he said, like, this does sound crazy, doesn't it? And I think I said, yes, it does.
That was former White House aide Hope Hicks testifying to the House January 6th committee, recalling when President Trump concluded that a certain woman's claims about the 2020 election sounded crazy. Tucker Carlson, before he got fired from Fox News, called the same woman an unguided missile, dangerous as hell, and a crazy person. And those are just the words I can repeat on television. Mr. Trump and Mr. Carlson were both talking about Sidney Powell, the former election lawyer who is at the center of Trump's efforts to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election. And despite believing her to be crazy and dangerous as hell and an unguided missile, Fox News, and more importantly, President Trump, ran with her ideas. Less than 2 weeks after Trump lost the election to Joe Biden, Powell joined Rudy Giuliani and others to claim, without evidence, that the socialist government of Venezuela and Hugo Chavez, who had been dead for almost a decade at that point, that they interfered in the 2020 election. China, according to Powell, was also part of that plot.
What we are really dealing with here and uncovering more by the day is the massive influence of communist money through Venezuela, Cuba, and likely China in the interference with our elections here in the United States.
3 years later, it still boggles the mind. But even after Powell went public with that wackadoodle theory, Trump considered making Sidney Powell a special counsel to investigate election fraud. That happened during an infamous White House meeting in December of 2020, a meeting that Sidney Powell, Rudy Giuliani, and others, colloquially known as Team Crazy, that they tried to have in secret with President Trump. In that meeting, Powell and others raised the prospect of seizing voting machines from key counties and deploying the National Guard to potentially rerun the 2020 election. White House lawyers and staffers, colloquially known as Team Normal, they had no idea that meeting was taking place, but the second they learned about it, they ran as fast as they could to put a stop to it. Powell herself later testified to the January 6th committee, while sipping on a Diet Dr. Pepper, it should be noted, that during that meeting, she also told Trump about findings pointing to security flaws in Dominion voting machines. She said the president was very interested in the information that apparently nobody else had bothered to inform him of. And because of these statements and many other things Sidney Powell has said, she is being sued, not by one, but by two companies that provided election software to the U.S. during the 2020 election, Dominion and Smartmatic. Ms. Powell has now admitted that many of her claims were false. And today, she pleaded guilty to 6 misdemeanor charges of election interference in Georgia related to her quest to try to help Trump stay in power, specifically her role in breaching voting machine equipment in Coffee County, Georgia.
Can you please state your true and correct legal name?
Sidney Catherine Powell.
How do you plead to the 6 counts of conspiracy to commit intentional interference with performance of election duties?
Guilty.
As part of the deal she reached with Georgia prosecutors, Powell will receive 6 years probation and must pay a $6,000 fine. Most importantly, though, her plea deal requires her to testify truthfully at the trials of any of the other Georgia co-defendants, including Donald Trump. So now that Sidney Powell is talking in Georgia, what does that mean for Donald Trump or for his co-defendants on Team Crazy, Rudy Giuliani and John Eastman? And more to the point, what does it mean for Jack Smith, the special counsel who is overseeing the federal election subversion case against Donald Trump? Neil Katyal and Anna Bowers will join me next to talk about the implications of this potentially seismic development. Stay with us. Joining me this hour, President Biden just gave what is only the second Oval address of his presidency, positioning America as a bulwark against the dark forces that are amassing across the globe, from Ukraine to Gaza.
Hamas and Putin represent different threats, but they share this in common. They both want to completely annihilate a neighboring democracy, completely annihilate it. American leadership is what holds the world together. American alliances are what keep us, America, safe. American values are what make us a partner that other nations want to work with. To put all that at risk, if we walk away from Ukraine, we turn our backs on Israel, it's just not worth it.
Biden's message comes as the world is essentially holding its collective breath, waiting for what comes next in the Middle East. Do you see all of the little dots in these satellite images? Those are hundreds of tanks and armored vehicles that Israel has deployed ahead of a potential ground invasion. That massive military buildup is waiting just about 4 miles north of the main entry point at Gaza's northern border, the Erez crossing. The Israeli military has been putting out videos like this one for days now, videos showing their tanks and troops training and preparing near Gaza's northern border. Today, Israel's defense minister, Yoav Gallant, traveled in person to tell Israeli troops near the border to get organized and to be ready. Whoever sees Gaza from afar now will see it from the inside, he said. I promise you. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was also near the border with troops today, and he told them, we are going to win with all our might, and asked the soldiers, are you ready? So the prospect of a ground invasion, which would be a major escalation and is expected to result in a dramatic increase in casualties on both sides of this war, that is very much a live issue at this hour. And while those Israeli ground forces are amassed at Gaza's northern border, potentially entering through the Erez crossing at any moment, we are awaiting a very different entry from Gaza's southern border. According to the aid group, the Red Crescent, more than 200 trucks with around 3,000 tons of aid are lined up at or near the Rafah crossing, waiting to be let through to deliver critical humanitarian supplies to civilians in Gaza. After repairs to that border crossing are completed, international observers will begin to inspect the trucks, making sure no weapons or supplies for Hamas are smuggled in. They will start by trying to get 20 trucks through the crossing tomorrow as a sort of test of the system. If that works, the hope is to start sending 100 trucks through that crossing every day. Trucks that would be filled with humanitarian supplies. That is the amount of aid Gaza received before the war began. So there is a potential ground invasion just across the northern border and desperately needed humanitarian aid just across the southern border, both potentially entering Gaza imminently. Meanwhile, the death toll of this war continues to rise. The IDF reports that 1,400 have been killed in Israel, and the Hamas-run Gazan Health Ministry, it reports that more than 3,700 have been killed in Gaza. This conflict is at a tipping point, and it could swing in a lot of different directions right now. Today, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu warned that this could be a long war. And as President Biden himself made clear tonight, it is not the only long war demanding American support. Just this week, we passed the 600-day mark for the war in Ukraine. In his speech tonight, President Biden stressed the importance of American support for both of these wars and why they both matter right here at home.
Why does this matter to America? Let me share with you why making sure Israel and Ukraine succeed is vital for America's national security. You know, history has taught us that when terrorists don't pay a price for their terror, when dictators don't pay a price for their aggression, they cause more chaos and death and more destruction. They keep going.
Joining me now is Virginia Senator Tim Kaine, member of the Senate Foreign Relations and Armed Services Committee. Senator, thanks for being here tonight. And I'm genuinely interested to know how you think the American public looks at these two battles, the one in Ukraine and the war in Israel. Do you think, I mean, President Biden tried to sort of contextualize them in the same lens, this broader fight against the forces of darkness, terrorism, fascism, what have you. Do you think the American public sees them through the same lens?
You know, Alex, I live in Virginia, which is a state that is just, if there's a more pro-U.S. military in terms of our history and veterans and active duty population and military families, you know, I don't know of one. We are a patriotic, pro-U.S. state. And I think the way people look at it here is it's a time in the world where it's sort of democracies versus destroyers. What the president said this evening is you've got dictators who want to destroy a neighboring democracy. You have terrorist groups that want to destroy a neighboring democracy. And democracies aren't perfect. We aren't here in the United States. Israel isn't. Ukraine isn't. But democracies are vastly preferable to those who want to destroy human rights, international law, and that's what's at stake right now. And that's why I think it was very important for the president to address the nation and talk about the linkage between what we are doing to support Ukrainians and what we are doing to support Israelis in their defense against this Hamas terrorist attack.
He was making a fairly eloquent, sort of laying out an eloquent thesis about the existential nature of the battle at this hour. But there's also this sort of political reality of what the White House is seeking, which is increased funding for Ukraine and Israel. And I wonder, given the shambles that is the lower chamber, the House of Representatives, whether you think his argument will help, once there is a speaker elected, move Republicans who may be somewhat recalcitrant on funding for Ukraine, seeing as the president would like to sort of bundle it in the argument he's making for Israel.
Yeah, Alex, I think you put your finger on a good point. We don't feel like there's, huge challenges in terms of providing support for Israel in their battle against Hamas. We have to make sure that they do it in a way that It minimizes civilian casualties, that supports humanitarian aid to Gazans, because Gaza is not Hamas. Palestinians are not Hamas. Palestinians and Gazans are under the thumb of Hamas. But how do you do this, and how do you convince Congress to do it? My sense is this: while the House is trying to figure out their leadership vacuum right now, the Senate has a bigger burden on its shoulders to act in a bipartisan way. When the president sends this package over, I think you're going to see us turn to it immediately. And my vote counting in the Senate tells me we have a big bipartisan majority to support aid to Ukraine, aid to Israel, the disaster relief aid that's commonly part of a fall supplemental package. And we will do that, and we will send it to the House with a big bipartisan margin. And as they're organizing, when we send it to them with that bipartisan margin, that's the way to maximize chance of success. So we'll go to work on this as soon as we're back next week, and the House will figure itself out. But I think the Senate can act in a bipartisan way to support these important priorities.
Senator, I got to ask you, because the president keeps invoking the specter of 9/11 when he talks about overreach, mistakes being made. There's also the reality that there was no necessary endpoint, no foreseen way of ending those wars at their outset. Should Democrats, should the White House be concerned about how the war between Israel and Hamas ends, given the fact that we are increasing funding? America is apparently all in on the side of Israel. Should there be concern or trepidation about what the end game actually is?
Alex, absolutely. America's all in the side of Israel against Hamas, but we have to draw the distinction that Hamas is not the same as Gaza. It's not the same as Palestinians. And if there is a lesson from 9/11, it is when you are attacked and you have the world's sympathy on your side, make sure that your response is calibrated against the perpetrator of the attack. When the U.S. went after Osama bin Laden or al-Qaeda, we had the world on our side. But when we allowed the mission to creep more broadly to a global war on terror, when we declared war against an Iraq that had nothing to do with the 9/11 attack, we lost support, we lost credibility, and we unleashed a string of consequences that were bad for the United States, bad for the region, bad for the world. And that's why President Biden went in person to talk to Prime Minister Netanyahu and others. You can provide support from afar, but if you want to look somebody in the eye and say, whatever your emotions right now, and the emotions are completely valid, you do not weaken yourself by being strategic in your response. That's why President Biden went to Israel, because he wanted to deliver that message in person. And I think we need to work with our ally Israel to make sure that they take steps in the coming days that make sure that the response is against the perpetrator, but not against the so many millions in Gaza who are suffering under the thumb of Hamas.
It is a very, very complicated high wire act right now. Senator Tim Kaine, such a pleasure to have you on the show. Thanks for your time, sir. Really appreciate it.
Glad to be with you. You bet.
Joining me now is Ali Velshi, MSNBC's chief correspondent and, of course, host of Velshi. Ali, we were just talking with Senator Tim Kaine about the sort of complexity here for the White House. I want to play a little bit of sound when President Biden was doing just what the senator was talking about, sort of trying to urge Israel in the most public fashion to abide by the laws of war. Let's take a listen to that, if we have it. Maybe we don't. Here's what he said.
At the same time, President Netanyahu and I discussed again yesterday the critical need for Israel to operate by the laws of war. That means protecting civilians in combat as best as they can.
What do you make of this?
Well, so a lot of people just, who aren't involved in wars think there are laws to war, but there are 5 basic principles in the laws of war, and that is your response needs to be proportional, that you don't, as much as possible, involve non-combatants, and that you sort of, do the thing as honorably and with as little damage as possible. I think what President Biden did when he first spoke after the massacre is he pledged unconditional support for Israel, which I think calmed a lot of feathers in Israel. Now, as this goes forward, and as we have not seen a ground invasion, which is going to be catastrophic on several levels, including, as Israelis say, for their own soldiers, because urban warfare is just a terrible thing. This is where President Biden is basically saying tonight, I've given you the assurances. I'm asking Congress for the money. We told you we're going to have your back on this and the weaponry and the ammunition. We need to proceed in a way that minimizes civilian casualties. As the senator says, the folks living there do not have agency. They are not picking their leaders. They're not elections. They're not opposition parties. And while it's interesting to say that Hamas is not Gaza and Gaza is not Hamas, Hamas is more intertwined into the lives of Gazans than you can imagine. They are all the hospitals. They are all the civil services, all of that stuff. So this is very complicated. The whole region is complicated. Israel-Palestine is complicated. Gaza is complicated. But the Hamas relationship to the 2.2 million civilians of Gaza is inextricable. That doesn't mean they support them. It means they can't live without them. So if you're going to take out or think you're going to take out Hamas, then there had better be some sort of plan as to what comes next.
And that's, something that we addressed as well with the senator, which is what is the logical endpoint of this war? Yeah. I mean, I will say what he was saying about Biden's trip to Israel in the context of trying to caution Israel,
yes,
it sort of reframes that, right? It wasn't just about showing solidarity with Israel. It was possibly also to say to Prime Minister Netanyahu, behind closed doors, do not violate the rules, the laws of war. Do not overstep this. Do not do what we did in 9/11.
And the other thing we did after 9/11 is if somebody had told us 20 years from now, this is how it's going to look, the bad guys are going to be in power, you won't have rooted out the evil you thought, and a whole bunch of people will be dead, and it'll cost you several $1 trillion, we might have done something else. So you can't look around a corner, so do your best to do that. I think President Biden was saying two things. One is minimize the damage and the risks and the civilian deaths. And two is just think 5 times about this, because you could get yourself into a situation like we did in Afghanistan, where in the end, your only choice was to leave. That's complicated. And a lot of Israelis who are really hurting also understand that if you don't have a way of rooting, taking this out by its root, make sure there's a plan to get out, because they don't want to end up with a whole bunch of Gazans in what is essentially a refugee camp that they have to. Well,
and that's a measurable difference between America involving itself in wars in the Middle East and Israel, which is centered in the Middle East. I have to ask you about the president's framing of Israel in the same context as Ukraine in this sort of broader existential battle for and against democracy. You have reported from both of these regions, and I wonder, I'll ask you the same question I asked the senator. Do you think the American public understands these to be the same sort of battles in the same context?
I had a little trouble understanding it. I understand the president doesn't give a lot of Oval Office addresses, and he had 2 jobs to do, because you have a Congress that isn't getting its business done, and he needs funding for both things. And Republicans are a little troublesome on the funding of Ukraine front. So he needed to do a couple of jobs, and he needed to explain that the U.S. has resources committed to do different battles. They're a little bit of apples and oranges, and I think it gets confusing when he did that. I understand what the intent was. He's saying we're doing two different things, and we need congressional and American support for it. They're just different. Their histories are different. Their causes are different. The underlying effects are different. So I did find that a little confusing, but I got the point he was trying to make. The problem is, in complicated, layered things like this, combining things sometimes doesn't get the point across.
I think it was, as much, I think, a genuine belief in his thesis, but also trying to tackle the matter at hand, which is like, we need to get Ukraine funding. We need to get
Israel
funding.
We do this all the time on TV, right? We try and put 2 things into one to deal with timing.
Never.
So
always.
I get the intent, but it was a tough one.
Well, listen, a lot is we're going to dissect the set of remarks over the course of the next 24 hours. And I thank you, my friend, for being with me for Rapid Response. Ali Velshi, host of Velshi.
Namah Shivaya, Om Namah Shivaya, Om Namah Shivaya, Om Namah Shivaya. क्या मांगू मैं तुझसे भोले, दूर हो गए संकट ये सारे। सब है दिया, नाम तेरा लिया, तूने सब है दिया, सारे संसार पर है तेरी नजर। ओ शिव शंकर, ओ शिव शंकर, ओ शिव शंकर, ओ शिव शंकर। तेरे दर पे आने से ही दिल को चैन मिलता है, जब जब देखूं तुझे मैं मन मेरा खिलता है। देखूं मैं जिधर तू दिखे है उधर, देखूं मैं जिधर तू दिखे है उधर, तूने खुशियों से भर दिया है दिल का नगर। ओ शिव शंकर, ओ शिव शंकर, ओ शिव शंकर, ओ शिव शंकर। ओम नमः शिवाय, ओम नमः शिवाय, ओम नमः शिवाय, ओम नमः शिवाय। बिखरा था टूट के पहले तूने मुझको संवारा है, मेरा भोला साथ खड़ा था मैंने जब भी पुकारा है। ना समझ बेखबर तेरी सब पे नजर, ना समझ बेखबर तेरी सब पे नजर। संग तू है खड़ा तो है कैसा डर। ओ शिव शंकर, 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 ओ शिव शंकर।